There are people who walk out of our lives, and yet they don't really disappear. They leave behind a feeling, like the story is still unfinished somewhere, as if both of you simply haven't found the words to continue it. And if you've ever been close to an Aquarius, you may have felt this more deeply than you expected. A kind of departure that doesn't quite feel like distance, but more like they've stepped back to understand something within themselves. Time passes, things seem to settle, quiet down, fade into the background. But then, in the most ordinary moment, a memory returns, a feeling brushes against you, soft but undeniable, and you find yourself wondering, did they truly let go? Or are they just taking a longer way around to come back? Because some returns don't begin with action. They begin with a realization. And maybe what we're about to explore today starts right there, in that quiet moment when something finally begins to make sense. Some relationships don't end with a period. They dissolve like morning mist. No one ever really says goodbye. And yet, both of you can feel the distance quietly growing. You may have found yourself standing in a familiar place, an old message thread, a song you once shared, and wondering, is this really over? With Aquarius, that feeling can be even more intense because they rarely leave in the way people expect. No slam doors, no long explanations. They pull away as if stepping back from their own life for a moment, soft, deep, and hard to name. It's not that the feelings disappeared, it's that something inside them started to grow too big. A question without an answer. A part of themselves they hadn't fully understood, or simply the quiet realization that they were beginning to lose themselves while trying to stay. And for Aquarius, losing themselves feels far more frightening than losing a relationship. So, they choose distance, not to run, but to breathe, to hear their own voice again, when everything around them has become too loud. From the outside, that silence may look like letting go. But if you listen a little closer, it feels more like a pause, a necessary pause so they don't speak before they truly understand. Because Aquarius doesn't do well staying in something they're unsure about. They don't want to promise when their heart feels lost. They don't want to continue without knowing where they're going. And so, they go quiet. Not the kind of silence people often assume, but something more like a room with the door gently closed, trying to heal. Inside that space, there may be thoughts that haven't found words yet, memories that haven't been sorted, and feelings they're not sure whether to hold on to or let go. If you've ever been on the other side of that silence, you may have felt the uncertainty, not knowing whether to wait or to move forward. And honestly, there isn't always a clear answer, but there is something worth sitting with. Not every departure is a sign of an ending. Sometimes it's simply someone trying to find their way back to themselves before they can truly return to anyone else. And if you see it that way, that distance isn't entirely a loss. It may be an unfinished journey, a circle not yet closed, a story still being written, that just somewhere you can't see. And maybe the real meaning of that departure isn't about who walked away, but about what each person begins to understand within the silence. Some relationships don't end with a period. They dissolve like morning mist. No one ever really says goodbye, and yet, both of you can feel the distance quietly growing. You may have found yourself standing in a familiar place, an old message thread, a song you once shared, and wondering, is this really over? With Aquarius, that feeling can be even more intense, because they rarely leave in the way people expect. No slam doors, no long explanations. They pull away, as if stepping back from their own life for a moment, soft, deep, and hard to name. It's not that the feelings disappeared. It's that something inside them started to grow too big, a question without an answer, a part of themselves they hadn't fully understood, or simply the quiet realization that they were beginning to lose themselves while trying to stay. And for Aquarius, losing themselves feels far more frightening than losing a relationship. So they choose distance, not to run, but to breathe, to hear their own voice again, when everything around them has become too loud. From the outside, that silence may look like letting go, but if you listen a little closer, it feels more like a pause, a necessary pause, so they don't speak before they truly understand. Because Aquarius doesn't do well staying in something they're unsure about. They don't want to promise when their heart feels lost. They don't want to continue without knowing where they're going. And so, they go quiet. Not the kind of silence people often assume, but something more like a room with the door gently closed, trying to heal. Inside that space, there may be thoughts that haven't found words yet, memories that haven't been sorted, and feelings they're not sure whether to hold on to or let go. If you've ever been on the other side of that silence, you may have felt the uncertainty, not knowing whether to wait or to move forward. And honestly, there isn't always a clear answer. But there is something worth sitting with. Not every departure is a sign of an ending. Sometimes it's simply someone trying to find their way back to themselves before they can truly return to anyone else. And if you see it that way, that distance isn't entirely a loss. It may be an unfinished journey, a circle not yet closed, a story still being written, just somewhere you can't see. And maybe the real meaning of that departure isn't about who walked away, but about what each person begins to understand within the silence. There's something quite unique about Aquarius. They can step very close into someone's heart and still keep a private sky within themselves, a space no one fully touches. It's not because they don't trust, it's because they need a place where they can still be themselves, even while they're deeply connected to someone else. Love, for them, isn't what feels frightening. What makes them hesitate is the quiet sense that they're beginning to lose the sound of their own inner voice. As things start to deepen, longer conversations, more subtle expectations, the emotions that are harder to name, they begin to notice a very small shift, but one that's enough to make them pause. It's as if they're standing between two currents, one pulling them closer to the other person, the other gently asking, "What about me?" And that question isn't something they can answer right away, because Aquarius isn't just looking for a relationship. They're searching for a way to exist within it, while still staying true to who they are. And when that answer isn't clear yet, they step back. Not as rejection, but as perspective. Like standing too close to a painting, everything blurs. Only when you take a step back do you begin to see the full picture. For them, that distance is a way of seeing themselves again within the story. From your side, it may feel confusing. You might wonder if you did something wrong or if something was missing. But sometimes the story isn't about enough or not enough. It's about a very personal journey, one each person has to walk alone. Aquarius isn't really walking away from you. They're trying to find their way back to themselves, to the place where unclear emotions, unnamed fears, and even their truest desires are still waiting to be heard. And that kind of journey isn't always easy, because facing yourself can feel harder than facing anyone else. It asks for honesty, a quiet kind of courage, and sometimes the willingness to accept things they once avoided. So, the distance they create isn't exactly empty. It's more like a long hallway, where they slow down, touching each thought, each memory, each feeling they never fully faced before. And maybe, at the end of that hallway, they begin to understand what they truly need, not to rush back, not to make a quick decision, but simply so that when they move forward one day, whether it's toward you or in another direction, they no longer feel like they're losing something inside themselves. And maybe, within that inward journey, something real is quietly taking shape. And then, after that stretch of silence, things don't really disappear the way people often assume. For Aquarius, there are things that don't need to be spoken every day, and yet they remain, deeply. They can move forward with life, working, meeting people, laughing, and seeming as if they've moved past it all. But there are very small moments, when the world slows down a little. A quiet evening, a familiar street, a song playing by chance, and the memory touches them, so lightly that almost no one would notice. but enough to make them pause for a few seconds. Not to hold on, not to turn back right away. Just a quiet presence of something that once mattered. Aquarius doesn't remember in loud ways. They don't retell it, don't replay it, don't try to show anyone that they still feel something. They keep it inside, like a book that's been gently closed, not read every day, but never truly put away. And what makes them different isn't whether they remember, it's how they sit with that memory. They don't rush to turn feeling into action. They don't let a single vulnerable moment decide an entire direction. Because somewhere within them, there's a quiet understanding that going back out of emptiness rarely leads to what they're truly seeking. And so, they wait. Not in a passive way, but in a space where emotions can settle, where things can become clearer, like cloudy water needing time to turn still again. Aquarius needs time to tell the difference between what they feel and what they truly understand. And during that time, they may pass through many different thoughts, moments of wondering if things could have been different, moments of seeing what they hadn't seen before, and moments where they quietly accept that not every story is meant to continue. But if something still remains after all those layers of thought, not a rush of emotion, but a steady kind of clarity, that's usually when understanding begins. An understanding that this memory isn't just an old habit returning, not just an empty space asking to be filled, but a signal that something in that connection still holds meaning. And that moment of realization, quiet, unrushed, becomes the starting point for a different kind of question. Not, should I go back? But, do I truly understand this now? And sometimes, just the act of asking that question is already a meaningful step forward, because for Aquarius, the journey isn't about returning quickly or slowly. It's about this. When they choose a direction, they understand why. And maybe, within that long silence, something deeper is slowly becoming clear, in a way only they can fully feel. And then, after all those long stretches of silence, something quietly shifts. Not a sudden awakening, no dramatic moment, nothing you could easily point to and name, just a very subtle sense of calm beginning to settle within them. It's like searching for something in the dark, and then, all at once realizing the light isn't coming from outside, but from the way you've started to see things differently. Aquarius isn't someone who changes perspective easily, but when they're ready to look back, they look deeply. They stop asking who was right, who was wrong, because over time, those questions begin to feel less important. And in their place, something else gently rises, softer but more honest. What truly matters to me? And that question can't be answered by logic alone. It asks for honesty, a kind of honesty deep enough to touch the things they once passed over. They may begin to remember, not what happened, but how they felt within that connection. A kind of peace that's hard to explain, a feeling of being themselves without having to try so hard. And then they realize some things aren't easily replaced, not because the other person was perfect, not because everything worked out smoothly, but because somewhere that connection touched something real within them, a part not everyone gets to reach. For Aquarius, this doesn't happen quickly. They need time to peel back each layer, each thought, each defense, each reason they once believed was true. And as those layers begin to fall away, what remains is often much simpler than they expected, no longer complicated, no longer needing to be overanalyzed, just a quiet clarity that some people, even without being perfect, still feel right in their own way. And what's interesting is, this realization rarely comes from how the other person has changed. It comes from within, from finally understanding what they weren't ready to face before, then understanding why they stepped back, understanding what unsettled them, understanding even the parts of themselves that were still unfinished. And within that understanding, a very quiet kind of growth takes place. Unseen, unspoken, nothing to prove, but enough for them to feel. They're no longer standing in the same place. And from that new place, they begin to look back at everything in a different way, not to fix the past, not to guarantee the future, just to understand more clearly what once mattered. and what perhaps still does. And maybe that soft moment when everything finally clicks becomes the point where a circle has a chance to close or open again in an entirely new way. And then, if one day they return, that moment rarely looks the way people imagine. No background music, no perfectly formed words they've been rehearsing for a long time. Not even a confident kind of arrival. Most of the time, it begins very quietly, a short message, a simple check-in, or just a presence finding its way back. So subtle that if you're not paying close attention, you might feel like nothing ever really left. Aquarius isn't the type to return with everything laid out in the open. They move closer, one small step at a time, not because they're unclear, but because they respect the journey they've been through. After all the silence, after facing themselves in ways they couldn't before, they understand something. Coming back isn't just returning, it's a different door, and that door can't be opened by the same versions of who you both used to be. So they try. They reach back into a space that once felt familiar. They sense whether things still feel the same. They wonder if that connection can exist in a new way. Lighter, truer, with less pressure. From your side, their return may bring questions. Why now? Do they really want to stay? Or is this just a passing moment? And honestly, those answers don't always come right away. Because for Aquarius, coming back isn't a declaration. It's a process where they move forward while listening to your response, listening to their own feelings, and listening to whether what they've come to understand is deep enough to stay this time. They're not trying to rewrite the past. They're not trying to make everything the way it used to be, because somewhere inside, they understand what has passed doesn't need to be repeated. And what they're searching for isn't a better version of the old story. It's the possibility of beginning again, in a different way, maybe slower, maybe more careful, but also more real. And sometimes their return isn't about continuing something. It's simply an opportunity for two people, after they've both changed, to look at each other one more time, in a new space, with a new understanding. And if there's something worth holding on to in that moment, it may not be that they came back, but how both of you choose to meet that return, without rushing, without placing too many expectations. Just a presence gentle enough to let things unfold naturally. And maybe it's that very gentleness that neither of you ever truly had the chance to experience before. And as the story arrives here, something begins to feel clearer. Very gently, but enough to make you pause for a moment. Because at the heart of all this, it may have never really been about the question, will they come back? When someone leaves, no matter how it happens, they always leave behind a space, an uncomfortable space, but a real one. And within that space, you begin to meet yourself again. Not the version you once knew, but a version learning how to stand. Even when no one is standing beside you the way they used to. The early days may not feel easy. Everything seems to slow down. There are moments when you wonder if you've lost something that truly mattered, but over time, something begins to shift. Not loudly, not in ways that need recognition. Just quietly, you begin to understand what you need, what you deserve, and how to stay with yourself without feeling like something is missing. If that kind of growth doesn't happen in big moments, it lives in the evenings you choose to stay in the times you no longer react the way you once did, in the way you begin to treat your own heart with more gentleness. And when you look back, you may start to see, if there is a return, it's only a small part of the whole journey. The greater part happened in silence, in the way you moved through days without answers, in the way you learned to release what no longer belonged to you, and in the way you came to realize your worth was never dependent on whether someone returns or not. If one day Aquarius comes back, it may be because both of you have changed. Not to become perfect, but to become more real. Light enough to carry fewer expectations. Aware enough not to repeat the past in the same way. And if that moment happens, it won't be a miracle. Just two people meeting again at a different point in time, after walking their own separate paths. And if they don't return, then maybe what they left behind was never emptiness, but a doorway. A doorway leading you back to yourself. where you learn to listen, learn to care, and learn to love, without needing someone else's presence to complete you. And in its own quiet way, that too is a kind of return. Not a return to them, but a return to yourself. The version of you may have forgotten somewhere along the way of loving someone else. And maybe that is where every story truly begins again.